I was there when she came into Elvis's life after Anita had gone. I saw and heard much, and many things I have chosen not to reveal. I know exactly who she is. In her book, she even claims that my grandma was so upset that she was leaving.
I remember the way the air felt inside Graceland that summer, thick with heat and a kind of stillness that only comes when something sacred is about to change. I was barely a teenager, sitting on the steps outside the kitchen when I first heard her name whispered, Priscilla. At the time, it sounded harmless, almost musical. But even then, something in my gut told me that name would echo through our lives far longer than any of us could have imagined. Elvis was different in those days, young, hopeful, trying to balance fame with family. He loved home-cooked meals, late-night laughter, the comfort of our grandmother's voice humming gospel hymns in the next room. Graceland wasn't just a mansion, it was a heartbeat. It pulsed with love, loyalty, and a kind of innocence that fame hadn't yet stolen. Every person there felt chosen, part of something bigger than ourselves. When Priscilla came into Elvis's life, she didn't walk through the front door like everyone else. She drifted in quietly, almost like smoke, soft at first, then impossible to escape. Elvis met her while stationed in Germany, and by the time she arrived in Memphis, people were already whispering. She was beautiful, no doubt about that, poised, polite, with that porcelain skin and big, searching eyes. But there was a stillness in her that made people uneasy, like she was studying the room rather than living in it. The first time I saw them together, she was sitting beside him in the den, barely speaking. Elvis was animated, telling a story about a show he'd done, laughing that big laugh that filled a room. But she just watched him, eyes locked, as if memorizing every move. My grandmother noticed it too. Later that night, she said quietly, "That girl's thinking 5 steps ahead and I don't like it." At first, no one said much. Elvis was smitten, and when he loved fully, no half measures. He wanted to believe in people, even when they didn't deserve it. He'd give away cars, jewelry, even money to folks who barely knew him. So when he told us he wanted Priscilla clothes, we didn't question it. We trusted him. We always did. But slowly, the rhythm of Graceland began to change. It wasn't sudden, more like a soft shifting of light that you only notice once the shadows grow long. Family dinners became quieter, the laughter faded. Elvis still smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Priscilla had a way of tilting her head, lowering her voice, and getting exactly what she wanted without raising it once. I remember one night in particular. Elvis was getting ready for a tour, packing the hallway in his robe, half distracted, humming to himself. Priscilla came downstairs wearing a calm that didn't match his energy. She asked sweetly if he'd cancel a few dates, said she missed him, said she worried about him. He looked torn, his eyes darting between love and duty. Finally, he sighed and said, "Honey, I gotta do what I was born to do." She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes either. That was the first time I felt the tension, the quiet battle that would only grow stronger with time. To outsiders, everything looked perfect, America's golden couple, young and beautiful, living the dream. But those of us inside saw something else forming behind the smiles, a slow erosion, a distance that wasn't physical but spiritual. Priscilla liked control. She was always arranging, correcting, refining. Elvis was spontaneous. He thrived on chaos, on the joy of the unexpected. But with her around, even the chaos began to feel scheduled. I once overheard a conversation between Priscilla and one of Elvis's friends in the kitchen. He said something about the fans, about how Elvis's energy came from the crowd. She replied, soft but sharp, "He gives too much of himself away. Someone has to protect him from himself." That line stayed with me, because I couldn't tell if she meant to protect him or possess him. As months went by, family visits became fewer, calls went unanswered, friends who had been by his side for years started to feel unwelcome. "It's not personal," Elvis would say, "Scylla just likes her privacy." But I saw the strain in his shoulders when he said it. He wanted peace, but peace never came easy in a house built on both love and legend. One afternoon, I walked into the living room and found Priscilla rearranging family photos. She moved Grandma's picture from the center of the shelf to the far corner, replacing it with a glamour shot of herself and Elvis. When she saw me, she smiled and said, "Just making space for new memories." It sounded innocent, but something about it made my stomach twist. That was the day I realized she wasn't just living in our world, she was rewriting it piece by piece. Elvis noticed things too, but he rarely confronted them. He wasn't built for conflict, not with people he loved. He'd rather shoulder the hurt quietly. I remember him once sitting on the back porch after a show, staring out at the garden. He said, "Donnie, you ever feel like you're living in a story someone else is writing for you?" I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. That silence said enough. The more Priscilla settled into his world, the more the old one faded. The cousins who'd grown up with him, the friends who'd shared the road, all started to drift away. She wasn't cruel outright, just selective. The house that once felt full of laughter now echoed with careful politeness. Even the music sounded different. One night after everyone had gone to bed, I heard my grandmother crying softly in her room. When I asked what was wrong, she just said, "The boy's losing his way and he doesn't even see it." Her hands trembled when she spoke his name. To her, Elvis wasn't just a star. He was family, flesh and blood, and she could feel the walls closing around him. Still, Elvis tried to make it work. He believed love could fix anything. He took her shopping, surprised her with trips, wrote songs that hinted at both devotion and pain. There were good moments too, laughter in the kitchen, family barbecues, quiet evenings by the piano, but even in those peaceful moments, something fragile lingered beneath, like a glass already cracked, waiting for the slightest touch to break. I remember one afternoon when Anita Wood came to visit Elvis's former girlfriend. It wasn't planned. She stopped by to drop off a gift for his grandmother. The air in the room went ice cold the moment Priscilla saw her. No shouting, no scene, just silence sharp enough to cut glass. After Anita left, Priscilla walked into the hallway, looked me dead in the eye, and said softly, "Some people don't know when their chapter is over." It sounded rehearsed, almost poetic, and it scared me more than anger ever could. That's when I realized something I never wanted to admit. Elvis wasn't steering the ship anymore. He was just trying to keep it from sinking. Over time, the cracks turned into canyons. Elvis's laughter came less often. The family started to whisper about him losing weight, losing sleep, losing joy. But if you asked Priscilla, she'd say everything was fine. She always said everything was fine, yet her calmness felt rehearsed, like she was playing a role for an audience we couldn't see. I'll never forget the last Christmas before they split. The house was decorated beautifully like something out of a magazine, but beneath the twinkling lights the tension was unbearable. Elvis tried to make it magical for everyone, singing carols, handing out gifts, smiling through exhaustion. But when he reached to hold Priscilla's hand, she pulled away gently, pretending to fix her hair. He laughed it off, but I saw the hurt flash in his eyes. It was gone in a second, replaced by that familiar grin. But I'd seen enough to know the truth. His heart was breaking in silence. Later that night, I overheard him at the piano, whispering to himself between chords, "I just want peace, Lord, just peace." The way he said it, it wasn't a prayer, it was a surrender. By the early 70s, their relationship was barely holding together. Fame had become a cage, and love had turned into a performance neither of them wanted to end. Priscilla still played her part perfectly in public, the loyal ex-wife, the grieving widow later on, but those of us who'd lived it knew how much had been lost behind the curtain. Sometimes I think back to that first day I saw her, standing in the hallway of Graceland, eyes wide, smile delicate, voice soft as sugar. I wonder if things could have been different. Maybe if Elvis had seen through the charm, or if someone had spoken up sooner. But you can't rewrite history, no matter how much you wish you could. The hardest part isn't what she did. It's what she took, our sense of family, the warmth that made Graceland feel like home. After she came, love became strategy, truth became opinion, and loyalty turned into silence. Even now, when I walk past those old photos, I can still feel the echoes of what used to be. The laughter, the music, the smell of coffee in the morning. And I can still see that moment, the one where everything began to shift. It was late evening and the sun was setting behind the white columns of the house. Priscilla stood by the window, arms crossed, looking out at the gates where fans still waited with signs and flowers. Elvis came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her, and said softly, "They love you too, you know." She didn't answer, just kept staring through the glass like the crowd was hers to command. That image never left me, because in that quiet I finally understood. This wasn't just a love story, it was a takeover. And from that moment on, nothing at Graceland would ever feel the same again. Graceland was never quiet after that. It just became a different kind of loud. Not the joyful, laughter-filled kind we used to know, but the kind that hums beneath the surface, restless, uneasy, like a storm that doesn't break. You could feel it in the way people walked softer through the halls, or how Elvis kept his voice low, as if afraid the walls themselves were listening. Priscilla had started to run things differently. Little things at first, phone calls went through her, appointments were rearranged. Elvis's cousins, the ones who'd been part of his life forever, suddenly found themselves standing outside gates that once opened automatically for them. "He's resting," she'd say, or "He's not seeing anyone today." And the family, raised on respect and loyalty, didn't argue, but we all knew something was shifting, something we couldn't quite name yet. I remember one afternoon when my mother drove up to Graceland with a casserole for Grandma. The guard at the gate looked uneasy. He said, "Mrs. Presley, I was told not to let anyone in today." My mother laughed like it had to be a mistake. But it was. That was the day I realized Priscilla's influence wasn't confined to whispers, it had power now, visible power. Elvis noticed, but he didn't want to see it. He always believed love could be managed with kindness. He thought if he just kept things peaceful, everyone would get along. That was his curse, he never liked confrontation. But sometimes silence becomes permission. Inside the house, it was a strange kind of theater. You could feel tension behind the smiles. Priscilla was gracious to guests, but her eyes always calculated. She'd remember who said what, who lingered too long, who disagreed. And if she decided you were trouble, you simply stopped getting invited back. It was never loud, never cruel, just efficient. Elvis began to spend more time alone. He'd retreat to the music room at odd hours, playing gospel songs like he was searching for something that used to anchor him. One night, I found him sitting at the piano, the light dim, his voice barely above a whisper. You know, Donnie, he said, I can feel people changing around me, like love turned into something else. I can't explain it. He smiled, but his eyes didn't match. The thing about manipulation is that it doesn't arrive as thunder. It's gentle, almost loving. It looks like concern. You're working too hard. They're using you. You need someone who truly understands. Over time, those words become chains disguised as comfort. And Elvis, kind-hearted to a fault, didn't realize he was being slowly isolated, not just from his friends, but from himself. Priscilla knew how to play the press too. She'd appear in interviews with that practiced sweetness, always careful, always balanced. She spoke like someone giving a eulogy for a man still alive. Elvis is such a complex person, she'd say, tilting her head. He struggles with fame, with loneliness. The audience would nod, sympathize, but to those of us at home, it felt like betrayal disguised as tenderness. Each word chipped away at his dignity, painting him as broken before he was even gone. I'll never forget the day Elvis found one of those magazine articles on the kitchen counter. He read it quietly, his hands shaking slightly. Then he set it down and said, "She makes it sound like I'm dying, Donnie, like I'm some sad story." He didn't yell. He just looked defeated. That kind of hurt is quieter than anger, and it lasts longer. At family gatherings, you could feel the divide widening. Priscilla would sit at the head of the table, smiling politely while conversations grew cautious. Grandma stopped telling her stories about Tupelo. She said it was like talking to someone who's already decided what she believes. My Uncle Vernon would glance at Elvis like he wanted to say something but didn't. Everyone walked on eggshells, hoping the old warmth would return. It never did. Elvis's faith was his refuge. He prayed every night, often alone, and read from the Bible before bed. He told me once, "The devil don't always come in horns, honey. Sometimes he wears perfume." He said it half-jokingly, but I caught the flicker of truth behind his smile. By the early 70s, the cracks in their marriage were too wide to ignore. Priscilla's life was shifting toward the world outside Graceland, parties, modeling, new friends who didn't come from Elvis's circle. She said she wanted to find herself. But to us, it felt like she was already halfway gone. Elvis tried to bring her back with gifts, jewelry, cars, even horses. But the more he gave, the more distant she became. You can't buy someone who's already sold on freedom. And yet, part of me felt for her. I could see the loneliness in her eyes, too. Living in Elvis's world meant living in his shadow, and not everyone could handle that. Maybe she really did feel trapped. Maybe she loved him in her own way, but love built on image will always crumble under truth. Still, the way she left, slow, deliberate, quiet, felt colder than any storm. When she finally moved out, the silence at Graceland was unbearable. Elvis pretended he was fine. He threw himself into music, into touring, into anything that kept him from thinking. But there were nights I'd hear him packing the hallways, whispering to himself, "I should have seen it coming. She was never mine to keep." Those weren't words of anger, they were words of mourning. After the separation, the world didn't give him peace. The tabloids circled like vultures. Priscilla's name stayed tied to his, and every time she spoke, it was like reopening a wound. She'd tell stories that made him seem unstable, reckless, addicted. But what people never saw was the discipline behind the scenes, the rehearsals, the generosity, the constant drive to be better. He wasn't perfect, but he was never what she made him sound like. The more she spoke, the more Elvis pulled away from public life. He surrounded himself with people who still believed in him, but even then he'd say, "They love what I give them, not who I am." Fame had turned into a mirror that reflected everyone else's version of him except his own. Sometimes I wonder if that was her intention all along, to become the gatekeeper of his memory. Even when they weren't together, she remained part of the narrative, always the spokesperson, always the interpreter of his truth, and that frightened me. Because the Elvis I knew, the man who prayed with us, who laughed until he cried, who'd stop a concert to hand his scarf to a child, that Elvis was being replaced by someone else's version. One afternoon, I found Grandma sitting on the porch folding laundry. She said, "You watch, child. Someday people will only know him through her stories." I told her that would never happen, but deep down I feared she was right. Elvis started talking about legacy more in those years. He wanted people to remember his music, his generosity, not the rumors. He once said, "If I die tomorrow, I hope they don't turn my life into a soap opera." I wish he could have seen how wrong that hope turned out to be. There were moments when he tried to reach out to Priscilla to make peace. He'd call her about Lisa, about memories they shared, but every conversation seemed to end with misunderstandings or soft accusations. "You were never there," she'd say. "You changed." He'd hang up and stare at the phone for minutes, lost in thought. He still loved her, even when she became a stranger. That's what made it so tragic. I remember one night after a show in Vegas. Elvis sat backstage, drenched in sweat, towel around his neck. He looked at me and said, "They think I've lost it, don't they?" I told him no, but he smiled sadly. "I can feel it. When the person you loved most doesn't believe in you anymore, you start to doubt yourself too." I didn't know what to say. I just sat beside him until the dressing room emptied and the lights went out. He kept giving everything he had to the stage, maybe because it was the only place he still felt control. Under those lights, surrounded by the roar of fans, he could be who he truly was. But when the curtain fell, he returned to the quiet, where every rumor, every betrayal waited like ghosts. By then, the family had stopped hoping things would go back to normal. We just tried to hold on to what was left of him, the kind man who gave Christmas presents to strangers, the son who called his father every morning, the cousin who never forgot your birthday. But the world only wanted the drama. The saddest part, Elvis still defended her, even after everything. She's the mother of my child, he'd say. She deserves respect. That was his heart too big for his own good. He'd forgive the knife even as it was being pulled from his back. Sometimes, late at night, I'd find him in the meditation garden, sitting quietly by the fountain. He'd look up and say, "Do you think people can change who you were just by talking long enough?" I didn't know then that he was already worried about how history would treat him, how she might shape it. I told him, the truth always outlives the lies. I wanted to believe that, I still do. In those final years, Elvis carried a weight none of us could fully understand. The loneliness was different, not from being unloved, but from being misunderstood. The person who once claimed to love him most had turned his life into a story she could control, and every time he tried to reclaim it, she found a new way to take it back. Sometimes I think about that night he played "You'll Never Walk Alone" alone in the living room. His voice cracked halfway through, but he kept singing anyway. That's how I'll always remember him, still standing, still giving, even when the world had taken almost everything. By then, I had stopped believing the damage could be undone. It wasn't just a broken marriage anymore. It was a rewriting of history in real time. Every interview she gave, every memoir she published, every soft smile on TV, it all chipped away at who he truly was. And yet, part of me still wanted to hope. Hope that she'd wake up one day and realize the harm. Hope that she'd defend him instead of dissecting him. But that hope faded too, because every time she spoke, her version became louder and his truth grew fainter. I sometimes think Elvis knew how it would all end, not just his life, but the way people would remember him. That's why he kept so many journals, why he recorded conversations, why he surrounded himself with witnesses to his kindness. Maybe he was trying to preserve himself before someone else erased him completely. And as for me, I stopped being afraid to say what I saw. Because silence, I learned, doesn't protect the truth, it buries it. And once the wrong version takes root, it grows like ivy, covering everything good that once was. The day I realized that was the day I stopped hoping for reconciliation. There's a moment when love turns into defense, and defense turns into war. For me, that moment came when I saw Elvis looking out the window, whispering, "She was supposed to be my peace." He said it softly, almost to himself. And in that whisper, I understood something that still breaks my heart to this day. He never stopped loving her, even when she turned his story into her own. After Priscilla left, the house didn't just feel empty, it felt haunted, not by ghosts but by memories that refused to leave. The sound of her heels on the staircase still echoed faintly even though she was gone. The perfume she wore lingered in the upstairs hallway long after the bottles were packed away. But the silence that replaced her voice was worse than any noise. It wasn't peace, it was absence. And Elvis carried that absence like a wound that never healed. He threw himself into the music again as if singing could cleanse him. Nights in the jungle room turned into long sessions, half rehearsal, half confession. He'd sit at the piano, hunched over, eyes closed, whispering through songs like Hurt or Separate Ways as if the lyrics were bleeding out of him. The guys would gather around, unsure whether to join or stay quiet. Some nights he'd break mid-song muttering, "She didn't believe in me." Then he'd start again, louder, as if to drown out the thought. People think Elvis lost himself because of fame or drugs. That's not true. He lost himself because love turned into betrayal and betrayal turned into disbelief. When the person you trusted most rewrites who you are, even your own reflection starts to feel like a lie. The press didn't help. They tore him apart, calling him erratic, unstable, addicted. They said he'd become a caricature of himself, a man bloated by fame and failure. But I saw the truth. He was fighting to keep his dignity while the world tried to strip it away. Every article, every interview from Priscilla or her circle seemed designed to remind him he was no longer in control of his own story. One night I found him sitting on the floor of his bedroom surrounded by photographs. Old black and white pictures of his mother, Gladys, of him in uniform, smiling, clean-cut, innocent. He held one in his hands and said softly, "They're turning me into someone I don't recognize." I tried to comfort him, but what do you say to a man whose legend has devoured his truth? He still had moments of joy, fleeting but real. Lisa's visits lit up the house. He adored her more than anything. You could see it in the way his face changed the moment she ran into his arms. She was his last link to innocence, the only part of himself he still trusted. He'd spoil her with gifts, sing lullabies to her, call her my girl. But when she left, the house would fall quiet again and the heaviness would return like a shadow. Around that time, rumors about his health started spreading. Priscilla's interviews added fuel to the fire. She spoke gently like a caretaker, implying concern while planting seeds of doubt. Elvis was struggling, she'd say. He needed help. Those words cut deeper than any headline because they didn't just question his body, they questioned his soul. The truth is, Elvis wasn't an addict. He was a man trying to stay upright under a weight no human could carry. His schedule was brutal. His diet, his medication, his exhaustion, it was all part of survival. People called it excess, but it was endurance. He gave everything he had to those who came to see him, even when he had nothing left for himself. The family saw what outsiders never did. We saw him reading scripture before every show, kneeling by his bed at night praying for strength. He'd say, "Lord, help me get through this one more time." He was still that boy from Tupelo at heart, still trying to make his mama proud. The drugs weren't pleasure. They were armor, thin, fragile, but sometimes the only thing between him and collapse. But Priscilla's version of events began to dominate the airwaves. Her soft-spoken recollections painted a picture of a tragic genius destroyed by his own vices. It was a careful, crafted narrative, part sympathy, part superiority. She positioned herself as the one who survived him, as if she had risen above his chaos. And every time she did, the family flinched, because we knew how much of that chaos was her creation. Elvis would never publicly fight back. "I won't talk bad about her," he'd say. "That's Lisa's mama." But you could see the frustration eating at him. Once, after another one of her interviews, he threw the newspaper across the room. "Why does she keep talking about me like I'm dead already?" he said, his voice cracked. "I'm still here, I'm still breathing." Even then, he tried to forgive. That was his nature. He believed that love, no matter how twisted, still deserved grace. But forgiveness without truth is poison. It eats you from the inside out. In the months that followed, Elvis began to withdraw even further. He stopped letting most people in, only keeping a small circle of those he trusted absolutely. I remember how protective he became of Grandma and Delta. He'd call every night just to make sure they were okay. Family meant everything to him, even when the world believed he'd forgotten it. But Priscilla's influence stretched even into death's territory. When Elvis passed, the confusion and grief hit us like a storm with no warning. People talk about that day as if it's history, but for us it's still a wound that never fully closed. The world wept for a legend, but the family mourned a son, a father, a cousin. And while we were still trying to breathe, she was already speaking for him. Almost immediately, stories began to shift, timelines altered, facts blurred. The narrative of his death became public property, edited and repackaged to fit someone else's memory. She said Grandma was the only family at Graceland in his final days, a cruel erasure of everyone who stood beside him until the end. My Aunt Delta was there. My mother lived just behind the property. We were all there. But in her telling, we vanished as if we'd never existed. It wasn't just falsehood, it was theft. The deliberate removal of those who loved him most from the pages of history. Even the sacred details were changed. She claimed Elvis and his mother were reinterred just 2 days after the funeral. But the truth we lived, was that it didn't happen until October 2nd. That might sound small to outsiders, but to us it mattered, because accuracy is respect. And when someone alters even the dates of a man's burial, they're saying his family's truth doesn't count. That was the breaking point for me. Watching her sit in interviews, smile sweetly, and twist our memories into something unrecognizable, it was unbearable. She'd speak about Elvis's struggles and tragedies like she was performing a monologue about a stranger. And the public, unaware of the real story, ate it up. They loved her composure, her poise, her charm. They never saw the cold calculation underneath. I remember watching one particular interview years later after Lisa's passing. Priscilla's voice trembled as she spoke of her daughter, but then, almost seamlessly, she pivoted to her book, her foundation, her control over the Presley estate. There was a moment where I thought, even grief isn't sacred anymore. What broke my heart most was what she did to Lisa's truth. Lisa had written openly about the abuse she suffered at the hands of her mother's boyfriend. She was raw, honest, brave. And instead of standing by her, Priscilla questioned her own daughter's words, hinting that Lisa's struggles made her unreliable. That was the cruelest cut of all. To discredit her own child, to silence the only person who could have balanced the narrative, was beyond betrayal. Elvis's blood ran through Lisa. She carried his gentleness, his contradictions, his soul, and when her voice was dismissed, it felt like losing him all over again. Because for those of us left, she was his echo, the living proof of his love, his humanity. I often think about the difference between what the public saw and what really happened inside those gates. The world saw a myth unraveling. We saw a man trying to hold his legacy together with his bare hands. Elvis wasn't perfect. None of us are, but he didn't deserve to be defined by half-truths told by someone who'd long stopped loving him the way he deserved. Years later, when I walk through Graceland during private hours, I sometimes stop by the meditation garden. The air is still heavy with memory. Tourists will never know the quiet grief that hangs there, the real story behind the photographs and plaques. The garden isn't just where he rests. It's where his truth is buried, waiting for someone to keep it alive. I kneel there sometimes and whisper, they're still talking, because they are. Decades later, the same voices, the same stories, the same distortions. And yet his presence, his spirit, still feels stronger than any lie. I remember his last words to me one summer night. He looked tired, older than his years, but there was still a fire in his eyes. He said, "They can say what they want, Donnie, but the truth always has a heartbeat." That's what I hold on to. Because even now, when her books, her interviews, her documentaries claim to know him best, I know the man who prayed before every show, who cried when he talked about his mama, who stayed up late making sure his daughter's dollhouse lights worked. That, Elvis, that's the truth. The fallout from those lies still burns. The fans are divided, the media feeds on speculation, and history keeps getting rewritten by the loudest voice, not the truest one. But I refuse to be silent anymore. Silence was what allowed the distortion to grow. If you walk through Graceland today, you'll see polished floors, glass cases, and tour guides repeating well-rehearsed lines. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the faint echoes of his laughter, the warmth, the humanity, the truth that can't be scripted. And that's why I speak. Because the world may have crowned her the guardian of his legacy, but she was never its heart. The real Elvis Presley lived and died surrounded by family, not alone, not addicted, not broken, but human, and that humanity deserves to be remembered. The night before his death, he was calm. He'd been reading his Bible. He told someone close, "I'm not afraid." I think in his heart he knew peace was coming, not from the world but from God, and maybe that's the one thing she can't rewrite. So when I see another interview, another film, another attempt to reframe his story, I remind myself she may own the headlines, but he owns eternity. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds its way home. There's a certain quiet that settles over Graceland in the early morning hours, the kind that feels almost sacred. The air smells faintly of magnolia, the marble floors glow under the soft light, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear a faint hum of music in the walls. That's when I feel him most. Not the legend, not the headline, but the man, the cousin I grew up with. The one who laughed so loud you couldn't stay mad at him, who prayed before every meal, who called his grandmother Mama like he was still 10 years old. The world remembers Elvis Presley the way they were told to, but the man I knew deserves to be remembered the way he was. When I look back now, I realize that truth doesn't die with a person. It just goes quiet, waiting for someone to give it voice again. That's why I started speaking out. Not because I wanted to attack anyone, but because silence is how history gets rewritten. And I couldn't stand to watch the last pieces of him, of us, be reshaped by the same woman who'd already taken so much. Priscilla once said she wanted to protect his image. But protecting something means keeping it whole. What she did was polish it until it no longer resembled the truth. She turned him into a myth, a broken genius, a man destroyed by fame and weakness, because myths are easier to control than men, but that's not who he was. He was gentle, stubborn, funny, complicated, faithful. He was human. And maybe that's what frightened her most. Because if people saw how human he was, they might see how much she'd taken from that humanity. Even now, every time I see her on a talk show or releasing another exclusive revelation, I wonder how she keeps doing it, speaking for a man whose real voice she spent years quieting. Lisa understood that conflict better than anyone. She lived in the crossfire, pulled between the mother who controlled the story and the father whose truth kept being buried. You could see it in her eyes, that war between loyalty and survival. She loved them both, but one love was soft and forgiving while the other demanded obedience. And that's a weight no child should ever carry. When Lisa passed, it felt like losing Elvis again, because she was him in so many ways: his humor, his temper, his generosity, his soul. She carried his contradictions. But even in her pain, she never stopped trying to find her father's truth beneath the noise. And when Priscilla challenged her will, when she tried once more to seize what was never fully hers, I knew the cycle hadn't ended. It had just found a new generation to haunt. People ask me sometimes if I think Elvis would forgive her. I think he already did, but not the way people imagine. Elvis believed forgiveness was between a person and God, not between victim and offender. He could forgive her in spirit and still mourn what she did. He could love her once and still see her clearly in the end, because love and blindness aren't the same thing. I remember near the end, someone asked him if he still thought of her. He smiled, that slow, quiet smile that broke your heart, and said, "You never stop caring for someone you gave a piece of your soul to. You just stop expecting them to give it back." Those words stayed with me, carved themselves into the silence after he was gone. There's a kind of irony in all this. The woman who once wanted to stand beside him forever has spent decades standing in his shadow, still trying to shape how the light falls. She's built a career on loving him in public while undoing him in private. But the thing about truth is, it doesn't need defense. It only needs time. Every time she speaks, I think of Grandma, her voice trembling but steady, saying, "Baby, lies can travel, but they can't stay." And that's what keeps me going, because the more she talks, the more people begin to notice the cracks. They start asking questions, they start digging. And little by little, the truth rises, the truth of who Elvis really was, not who someone decided he should be. Sometimes I walk through Graceland after the crowds are gone. I pass the piano where he used to play late at night, the staircase he'd descend in his robe, humming gospel songs. I stop at the kitchen where he'd sneak peanut butter sandwiches and laugh when Grandma scolded him. In those quiet moments, I can almost hear him again, not the performer, the man, the son, the cousin, the heartbeat of a family that still aches for him. What hurts most isn't that he's gone. It's that so many people never truly knew him, the depth of his kindness, his faith, his laughter. They know the costume, the hips, the fame, the glitter, but not the man who wept after singing How Great Thou Art. Not the man who sent money anonymously to strangers who wrote him letters of need. Not the man who held his daughter like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. And I think about how Priscilla still speaks his name, how she claims to honor him while erasing the people who stood beside him. She says she was his greatest love, but love that wounds, manipulates, and rewrites cannot be love. It's possession dressed as devotion. And Elvis, in his purest heart, knew the difference. I'm not bitter, though it may sound that way. I'm tired of watching his story twisted into something he wouldn't recognize, tired of pretending silence is respect. Because true respect means telling the truth even when it hurts, and sometimes it means standing alone. There's a passage in James, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. I think about that often, how envy can destroy not just people but generations, how it can turn love into strategy, family into competition, and legacy into war. I don't speak out of hate. I speak because I loved him, because I still do. Because I watched him give the best of himself to a world that never stopped taking. And because I know deep in my soul that if he were here, he'd want the truth told, not for revenge but for peace. Elvis didn't belong to any one person. He belonged to the millions who found hope in his voice, to the family who saw his laughter in the morning and his tears at night, to the faith that guided him through every storm. That's what legacy means, not ownership but continuation. And when people ask me what I want remembered most about him, I say this: he never stopped believing in love, even when it broke him, even when it left him alone. He believed that love, real love, survives lies, distance, even death. That's what still makes his music feel alive. That's why 50 years later, people still cry when they hear Can't Help Falling in Love. Because he meant it, every word. I've accepted that the story will never be perfect. The truth will always be tangled with rumor, and some people will always prefer the version that sells. But as long as I have breath, I'll keep speaking for the version that lived, the boy from Tupelo who made the world stop with one song and never forgot where he came from. Sometimes I stand by his grave and whisper, they're still listening, because they are. Maybe not all of them know it yet, but they feel it, that pull in their chest, that ache in their soul when his voice comes through the radio. That's not nostalgia, that's connection, that's truth outliving falsehood. And when I leave the garden, I always look back. The marble gleams, the flowers sway in the wind, and I think this is what she could never control. You can rewrite facts, but you can't erase spirit. You can own a name, a brand, a business, but you can't own a soul. Elvis's spirit is still here. It's in the laughter of fans who weren't even born when he died. It's in the quiet tears of those who knew him personally. It's in every gospel note that still shakes a heart awake, and it will outlast every lie told in his name. The world can debate who he loved most, who wronged who was right or wrong. But when the lights go out and the noise fades, the truth still sings. And it sings in his voice, raw, imperfect, but real. That's what I want people to remember, that behind the legend was a man who just wanted peace. And maybe in some quiet way he finally has it, because love doesn't end where life does, it just changes form, it becomes legacy, it becomes truth. And maybe that's the justice in all of this. No matter how much she tries to own his story, it will always belong to the people, to those who still believe that greatness doesn't come from power or control, but from humility and heart. Because when all the noise fades and all the books close, what remains isn't her version or mine. It's his, the laughter, the music, the faith, the light, the truth that will keep shining long after both of us are gone. That's what endures, that's what wins in the end. Sometimes I wonder if truth and love are the same thing, both fragile, both unkillable. Elvis proved that. Even surrounded by lies, his light never went out, it just found new hearts to live in. But I want to hear from you. Do you think love can survive betrayal? Can truth ever belong to one person, or does it belong to all who care enough to protect it? Tell me in the comments, because your voice is part of this story too. If you don't want to miss the next hidden truth behind the Presley legacy, subscribe now. Stay with us when we uncover the next chapter they tried to erase. Because every story has another side. And somewhere between love and loss, the real Elvis is still waiting to be found.